This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and I'm excited about the show today because we do have a special guest that's going to be sharing her story. As a friendly reminder, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. Well, Ms. Wanda, welcome to the One Human Nation show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm so grateful that you are here and able to join us. So let's start with just a little background information as far as where did you grow up?
I actually grew up in Savannah.
You born and raised in Savannah?
I was not born in Savannah, but I was raised in Savannah.
Okay.
Moved here when I was a baby.
Okay.
And stayed here through high school. Went to Beach High School.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Fabulous. So give us an idea about what that experience was like. Well, before we get to the Beach High School, what stories did you hear about race and racism? And just as a clarification for our listeners, Miss Wanda is African American. So what stories did you hear?
Well, you know, it wasn't just stories I heard. We lived the experience of Jim Crow laws, mm-hmm. Separate and unequal. Mm-hmm. Everything was separate when I was growing up. Separate schools, separate places of worship. In many cases, separate shopping experiences. Although we went on Broughton Street, there were things that we could or could not do, including having jobs behind the counter. I would say behind the counter jobs. Right. There were people who were doing some, sweeping and things like that, but they were not able to sell. We were limited in terms of medical care, because hospitals were segregated, and I had an experience in my own family where that became a major issue for someone who was very close to me. Our doctors were black, our lawyers were black. Mm-hmm. We went to a black pharmacy on what was then called West Broad Street, now Martin Luther King. So my whole world was pretty much African American at the time. So when you say what were my stories, what stories did I hear? I lived those stories.
And what time period was that? Just
the 50s and the 60s.
50s and 60s, yes. Okay, because I was born in 58, so I came a little bit behind you. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me how the stories change from decade to decade, depending on who is sharing their story. Sure. Because Savannah had a very vibrant African American community, because during that time period that you're mentioning, it was segregated.
Yes.
So we could only depend on ourselves. And, I grew up on the South Side. So it was very interesting there, because even though we didn't have hospitals in the area, mm-hmm. We definitely had midwives. Mm. It was very interesting when I saw my dad's mom's birth certificate. She listed that, it was a midwife. Mm. And I actually have a picture of the midwife, because my dad took pictures a lot, and it was a black and white brownie camera. And Miss Sophie, who is somebody that was all. I think everybody is related in the Coffee Bluff area, White Bluff area.
Well, actually, the situation of giving birth was in part why I was not born in Savannah, because my mother's brother, my uncle, was a physician in Columbus, Ohio. And when she became pregnant, he sent for her and had her come to Columbus and live with him in the last part of her pregnancy, so that I could be born in a city that had outstanding medical care. So I was born in 1949. I'll just put that out there at University of Ohio University. I'm sorry, Ohio State University in Columbus. Okay. And I did not live in Columbus. I think my mother brought me back, I'm told, after her initial 6-week period of being quarantined like they used to do in the old days. She brought me back. Which is not a bad idea. Exactly. She brought me back on the train when I was 6 weeks old to Savannah. Wow. So that's why I wasn't born in Savannah. So technically, and we'll get into this, but as a journalist, we know that the word native means you're born in a place. Right. I don't call myself a native of Savannah, but I lived in Savannah from 6 weeks through. You were raised in Savannah? In high school, yes. So what was that experience like going to Beach High School? Because my mom was actually a graduate of Beach High School. She was trying to remember what year she was born. I can't remember what year she was born. For some reason, the year that's sticking in my mind was the year she got married, which, she was born prior to that. But she was a graduate of Beach High School, and that's where she learned the secretary trade, going through Beach High School, and her English skills. I can't remember the teacher that she'd mentioned to me before, but what was your experience like going to Beach High School? Well, considering my mom was born in Savannah. She was the only one of her siblings born in Savannah, and she went to Beach Kyler School at the time. I would imagine she had some of the same teachers that your mother had, because in those days, I think the teachers stayed in one place for a long, long time. Exactly. And in fact, one of the teachers that I had, who was my mother's English teacher, when I told her I was taking a class from her, she said, "Oh my gosh, she's one of the hardest teachers in the school." So she had been there for my mother as well. Right. The experience for us was wonderful at Beach High School. We didn't know, the Brown versus Board of Education came about in the 50s, but I don't remember the day when everybody was just sort of celebrating that or talking about it. We just knew that we were in school, that everybody sort of looked like us, that they were mostly from the neighborhood, or I'll call it the community. And we were we felt very supported by teachers who went out of their way to make sure that for those of us who were who had promise for great futures, that they taught us in a way that would support what we wanted to do, and that was to go to college, to be focused on careers. And for those who weren't focused on college, like you said, your mom took the secretarial, there were tracks for education that supported people who wanted to do other things. If people wanted to be a carpenter, and they took shop classes, they learned a lot of skills. My own grandmother, who had her own business in cosmetology in Savannah, also taught night classes in cosmetology at Beach High School for adults. So there were opportunities for people to learn all sorts of trades. But we really felt supported. We learned not only the educational things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, as they used to say, but we also learned how to be good citizens among ourselves. Civic engagement. We learned that social action and supporting the community was very important. We learned some of the social skills, if you will. And we had clubs and organizations where we learned leadership skills, which for me was something that planted the seed of leadership for the rest of my life, and my career and my life. So after Beach High School, where did you go? After Beach, I went to Spelman College. My family, like a lot of families, used to say, you can either go to college locally and get a car, or you can go to somewhere else and get a not get a car, but leave home. Leave home. And actually, Spelman was I was very fortunate to grow up in a family that was well educated, and Spelman was a family school for us. I was third generation. My grandmother and her sister went to Spelman during the turn of the century, the 1920th century. My grandmother, as I said, ended up in cosmetology, and she had her own business as teaching cosmetology. Her sister was a teacher in North Georgia. My grandmother's first child was a teacher in public schools in Savannah, and then I went to Spelman. So third generation Spelman graduate. I majored in English. Always knew that I wanted to be a journalist, but I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to go to Spelman, Spelman didn't have journalism,
right,
and so English was my major.
Right. So I know that you also received additional degrees. So where did you go, or what happened after the Spelman experience? Where did you start working?
I went straight to work.
Yeah.
I did. I went straight to work. I got a lot of additional training at some other universities. I did some training in a special program at Temple University, and I did a summer at Northwestern University, but I did not get an advanced degree.
Right.
I don't have an advanced degree. But I went straight to work. I went to my first newsroom in Providence, Rhode Island.
All righty.
While I was a student at Spelman, and after my junior year, I had an internship. So this internship, sponsored by an organization called the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund, sent me to Temple University for 3 weeks for a crash course in copy editing, which is what I wanted to do, not reporting. And then they sent me to Providence. And at the end of the summer in Providence, the managing editor called me into his office for a review and said, he liked the job that I did, and if I had an inclination to come back after I graduated from Spelman, that I had a job waiting for me.
Right.
And so I went back to Providence after I graduated from college.
So what was the culture back then for being in the journalism field, even though you weren't doing direct reporting? Mm-hmm. What was the culture like?
First of all, the culture was very white.
Mm-hmm.
My first newsroom in Providence, I was the only person of color and almost the only female professional in the newsroom.
Wow.
There were a couple of secretaries. There were what we call the ladies in the dictation pool, because back in the day, people would call in their stories from the field, go in a phone booth and call in their stories. But there were not many people who looked like me, either in terms of gender or race.
Right.
Providence, being not in the South, I would not say it was a racist environment, but it was a curious environment. And that was, people were curious about where I came from, how I got there.
Right.
So I had a few questions in the newsroom about, how did you do this? We had never, and quite frankly, when I went into journalism, not a lot of people even had a college degree. So they were really curious about, okay, here's a black person, a female person
that's articulate,
that has a college degree and that's articulate and ended up in this professional role in a newsroom where most of us, meaning them, did not have the opportunity to go to college, because before my generation, men, and I will say most 95% men, did something called an apprenticeship in a newsroom. They started as a copy boy, and that's what they were called, boys, and they sort of moved up, and if someone took an interest in them, they would give them a shot at writing a story or editing a story. So I just walked into the newsroom as a professional because I had the training. And even though I didn't major in journalism, I took many journalism classes across the street from Spelman at Clark College, now Clark Atlanta University. So I had those classes. I had a very supportive journalism professor at Clark, and I had the experience at Temple University.
Right. So I think that's what's really interesting about your story, is the level of support that you had through the educational institutions you were going through. And I wonder how much of that, because I talked to some of the youth, and it's different now. It's a different world now. And they have counselors, of course, that kind of deal. But sometimes I don't think the kids are getting the counseling that they need to really prepare them for which track they're going to be on. And I've been very impressed in Savannah to see that they, not only on the national level, but, for Savannah, it's very much focused on, well, maybe you'll be on a vocational track. Maybe your aptitude and your interest is more in being, going through electrician or being a plumber. And, the benefit to that is, they don't come out of school, college with the debt, because when it may have been the same thing for you, but when I went, because I went to Mercer University, I graduated from high school from Windsor Forest in 1976. And so then I went to Mercer University, but at the time they offered plenty of grants, and because they were trying to attract more African Americans, and so I got out of college with only $2,500 in student loan debt, and that's not the case now.
No, it's not the case. And I'm very proud that my family was able to support me, and I came out with no debt.
Right.
And I had and maintained scholarships all the way through.
Right.
So, and I worked on campus. And
right.
so with the combination of all those things, I came out with no debt. And it was a good supportive lesson for me, because one of the things, I have one daughter, my husband and I
right.
have one daughter, and one of the things that I was dead set on was that she would graduate from college many years later in 2004, and
right.
she also had no debt. So it can be done.
It can be done.
She did have an academic scholarship,
and that's the key. Mm-hmm. You've got to have the grades,
and then she had to maintain it. She
right,
knew that.
Right,
and that was the expectation. And so she worked really hard.
Right,
and, she did things like she pledged in a sorority, and a lot of people say, well, if you pledge in a sorority, will your grades go down? Her grades were better.
Right.
After pledging in the sorority, because they made sure that they took the entire group into
right.
the library and studied every day.
Right. Yeah, I think that's and it's a generational thing, and it's what I see in Savannah, some of the mindset of people that have been exposed to generations of poverty mm-hmm. is that why should we bother? So I lived in Texas for 35 years and moved back to Savannah in 2016. And I always visited because my parents were here, and this is where I grew up. But I didn't really start paying attention to things until I started really engaging, getting back involved in the community, and started doing this radio show in April 2017. And it was of a concern to me that we still had, the projects. We still had Yamacraw Village. We still had flooding in areas that flooded when I grew up here.
But let me say this. Several of the students in my high school class
right.
grew up in the projects.
Right.
What they call the projects.
Right.
There. They ended up being some of the top performers in our class, including our valedictorian, who grew up through, I think, middle school, what we then called junior high school.
Right.
And 2 or 3, we had 4 salutatorians in our class. I'm pretty sure at least 2 of them grew up in the projects with
right.
her. So in those days, I don't know what it's like now, but
right.
in those days, people were motivated to get out
right.
of the projects.
Exactly.
It wasn't a lifelong experience for many of them.
Right.
They wanted to have a better life for their
right.
children, and so they saw that as an opportunity to have, I guess, reasonable housing cost
right.
until they could get on their feet and then go somewhere and buy a house, which is
right.
what many of my friends' families did.
Right.
But they were motivated for education, and then once they showed the initiative in school, the teachers supported them. They
right.
took an interest and they supported them.
Right. And yes, I definitely don't want to give the perception that everybody that lives in the projects is not motivated, mm-hmm. because I did mortgage loans and I worked with people that were in Section 8 housing, and some of them had college degrees. Mm-hmm. It was just their circumstance right. that they needed affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And, but they were on that track to get out of that and buy a home and, that kind of deal. And that's how I interacted with them, because I was actually doing their mortgage loan. Mm-hmm. And in Austin, and I don't know if they have it here, but they had what was then called a self-sufficiency program. So when you enrolled in that program, you had a lower rent. Mm-hmm. And the difference was applied to your housing fund. Mm. So once you got out of the program, you had money for your down payment and closing costs and, that kind of deal. But anyway, so getting back to your story, so how did it continue for you being in the journalism field after you did the Providence experience?
Well, I worked in my career at 7 daily newspapers and maybe 4 universities.
Okay.
Some of it concurrent while I was working in newsrooms. I worked in Providence. I went to, for 2 years, I went to the Miami Herald for a year and a half.
Okay.
I went to the Atlanta Journal for a few months, less than a year. I went to Washington, D.C. because I was married to someone who I had met in Providence. He was a Navy Vietnam veteran at the time, and active duty Navy. But years later, we reconnected,
right.
and we got married. And he was living by then, after he got out of the Navy, in the Washington, D.C. area, because that's where his family was.
Right.
And so when we thought about where we would live after marriage, he had a position he really liked and was comfortable with his family in Washington. I was, I hadn't been at the Atlanta Journal long enough to care. So we moved to Washington, to the Washington area. So I worked at the Washington Post for 11 years.
Wow.
And then I went to USA Today for 10 years.
Right.
USA Today is owned. They change ownership, so exactly. I'm trying to remember. They had a split in the company, broadcast versus print, but it's owned by the Gannett Company.
Okay.
And so once I got into the Gannett Company, I worked for 3 papers in the Gannett Company, USA Today. After that, I went to the Greenville News in Greenville, South Carolina.
Right.
Left the newspaper business for about 4.5 years, and then came back to Gannett and was executive editor at the Montgomery Advertiser in Montgomery, Alabama.
Okay.
In that break for 4.5 years between Greenville and Montgomery, I went to Nashville, and I started a program for journalism, to teach journalism at Vanderbilt University.
Okay.
It was called the Diversity Institute, the Freedom Forum Diversity Institute at Vanderbilt University.
Okay, well, I think that's a good point for us to take a break.
Okay.
And make some announcements here, and we're going to come back and talk more about how you see the role of mass media now, and your experiences with that. So let's make a couple of announcements, starting with our public service announcement.
Sweetfield of Eden Baptist Church presents the 6th annual Pinpoint Seafood Festival on Saturday, September 15th, from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. on Pinpoint Avenue near Savannah. This event celebrates the culture of this century-old Gullah Geechee community with music and food. To find out more, find Pinpoint Seafood Festival on Facebook or call 912-596-1337.
Support for this portion of WRUU LP programming comes from listeners and Savannah Stopover, presenting An Evening with Velvet Caravan live in concert on Friday, September 14th at the Lucas Theater with jazz singer Annie Selick and the Atlanta Balkan Brass Band Mercury Orchestra. For more information and tickets, go to SavannahBoxOffice.com.
WRUU listeners like you crave exploration and discovery. That's how we can offer your business or organization a unique way to separate your name from the clutter inherent in commercial radio advertising. Underwriting on non-commercial WRUU will make your name stand out because we allow only a limited number of sponsorships per hour, and your message will be reaching listeners who are actively engaged in programs that demand their attention. Let our team build a customized plan to meet your marketing goals by linking your name to our unique music and talk programs. For more information, email underwriting@wruu.org.
This is WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and we have a guest in the studio, Wanda, that has extensive experience in the mass media. I will tell you we're having a little technical difficulty, so she can't hear the clip that I'm about to play, and it's from an individual, guys that those that listen to me all the time, that I'm always on YouTube looking for clips, and this was an individual's point of view, and this was published in February of 2014 by a gentleman by the name of Shabazz, also known as, I guess this is Negro Damas. But keep in mind, this was published in February 2014. And his conversation, which is going to be a very short clip, was about how he felt like mass media influenced negatively in the African American community. And so what I'll do, since our guest can't hear it, I'll do some recaps. And so she can tune in to what her experiences was and what's changed, because this clip was in 2014, and it's entitled Brainwashing of Blacks by Main Street Media. So there are some opinions that he expressed that I'm not in agreement with, but the whole point of the One Human Nation show is that we have an open and honest dialogue and hear different points of view. And sometimes those opinions are not opinions that I even reflect myself, but I think it's good that we listen to some differing opinions. So I'm going to start this and stop it probably after, a couple of minutes or so, and kind of do just a recap with our guest so she can respond, and then we'll resume the clip. So let's take a listen to Mr. Shabazz as he talks about the brainwashing of blacks from Main Street media.
I wanted to make a quick video today regarding the topic of media brainwashing, specifically of black people. You might ask, what is media brainwashing? And my answer to that is a systematic portrayal of blacks in a certain way that makes blacks feel a certain way about themselves and other people feel a certain way towards blacks. And it's all subconscious. Nothing's being blasted out saying, look, these people are that way and you should look at them as such. Because see, racism ain't straightforward no more. It's not segregation and physical attacks. It's all a mind game now. Basically, black people are hooked into the matrix, and the matrix being a false reality of themselves. First is that the true history of blacks isn't taught to American students. Basically, black kids are taught that their history goes back to white people owning them, and that's it. Nobody ever.
So we're going to stop the clip right there so we can get some feedback from Wanda. So basically what he's talking about is the systemic portrayal of blacks through media in a negative way, and a lot of it he refers to unconscious bias, and so it plants the seeds in people's mind that blacks are portrayed a certain way, and he'll get into rap music and the negative language in that, but you were more involved with, I guess, written journalism.
Yes, I worked for newspapers. I had a radio show, and I've done some television, but as a guest, not as a host.
Right.
But I certainly am in tune with journalism as a whole. Rap music I cannot speak to. I know that that's a very popular genre today, but it wasn't something that I ever. I just don't listen to it. So but I know that some of the lyrics can be inflammatory and racist on the part of African Americans, being racist as well. So I've listened to it enough for that, but I made it a point that rap music was not something we would hear in our house when my daughter was growing up. So I just never really got involved with it. In terms of newspapers, there has been a long pattern of news organizations. I won't just say newspapers because broadcast television and radio is the same. News is the same. There's been a long pattern of trying to make sure that our news organizations are diverse in two ways. One in terms of staffing and one in terms of content. To that end, there has been a lot of training and conversation within news organizations about how to portray people who are different, how to, a lot of racism in news coverage is by omission.
Right.
Because those stereotypes are built up. If you're a person who, if you're, I'm just going to use this as an example. If you're a white person and all you see is negative portrayal of people of color, black, African Americans in my case, then you probably have a propensity to think that all African Americans think about African Americans in a negative way. Right. I'll give you an example. In newspapers where I have worked, especially at USA Today, there was always a conversation about how to portray people of color who are somehow involved in the criminal system. Right. Whether they have been tried or not, because we're all innocent until proven guilty. Supposedly. People don't really see it that way. At USA Today, believe it or not, back in I was there in the 80s and 90s. Okay. There was a rule that every day above the fold, and that is the top half of the page 1, there would be a positive portrayal of a person of color, at least one person of color, and a female. Interesting. Every day. That was a rule. We had a lot of pushback from staff members who thought, well, that's pushing it too far. But in order to train people.
Right.
It's like Pavlov's dog.
Right.
You got to train people to think that way.
And they have to hear the message over and over again.
Positive reinforcement.
Right.
Or reinforcement in this case. That rule was hard and fast, and I understand why a lot of people didn't like that, but it worked.
Right.
It made sure that people who read USA Today every day, before they picked up that paper from the newsstand or from the hotel lobby table or something like that, or at the airport, because we sold, we had a lot of papers in airports, they would look at a page and say, "Oh, there's a female golfer on the front page." Or there is an African American who's a business owner, or a doctor, or a pilot.
Right.
There was that, and then there was something called mainstreaming of content. That is making sure that people of color and women are portrayed in the mainstream of news. For example, let's just say there's a hurricane coming.
Right.
We're in the midst of hurricane season, and you need to talk to a meteorologist. Do all the meteorologists you talk to have to be white and male?
Right.
Absolutely not, because there are
female
meteorologists, and there are people of color who are meteorologists. Right. So in the mainstream of news, and this is not, talk to someone who's different from time to time. Doesn't have to be every time. In order to do that, you have to know who these people are before the hurricane is coming.
Right.
And so training people to put together what we called a source guide.
Right.
Diversity source guide of people who are experts in aviation, in medicine, in carpentry.
Right.
You talked about carpentry and plumbers and people in learning those skills, those vocational schools. Well, I will tell you, every time I need a carpenter or a plumber, they make a lot of money, probably more money than I make.
Exactly.
So there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
You need those skills, but why not portray those people who are people of color instead of always a white and a male?
Right.
And so when you think about people who think negatively of people of color, for example, or women, they see that reinforced every day in some media. And so part of the media's responsibility is to make sure that we are portraying people who are different in positive ways, and not overly portraying people who are people of color, for example, or women, in a negative way.
Right.
And so one of the things in a couple of newspapers where I was a top editor was that I reached out to the police department and had the chief of police come in and talk to my leaders in the newsroom about what does it do in this community, in those communities, when every time you pick up the paper and you see a black male mugshot on the front page. What does it do? And there was, the police officers got a lot of flack for that, because they thought, oh, we're overly arresting young black males, and we're still having that problem today. Not just with the media, but and the police officers and chiefs told me it is a fact that in those days, at least, and I don't know what it is today, and I certainly I never worked in Savannah in a newspaper, so I don't know, but it is a fact that more African Americans are arrested than other people.
And that's still the case today.
It is still the case today. However,
and we're a smaller percentage of the population.
We don't know about convictions yet.
Right.
And it does put that negative thought in people's minds, and it causes the things that we see all the time. A black male walking down the street, a woman clutches her purse. A black male gets in an elevator, a woman moves to the side and almost climbs up the wall because she's afraid to stand in an elevator with the person of color. Those kinds of stereotypes make people afraid of people, when in fact the black male who got on the elevator might be, I don't know, somebody like Jay-Z.
Right.
You don't know.
You don't know.
You don't know who they are and what their story is.
Right.
Just because they're wearing some sneakers and a hoodie.
Dressed down.
Exactly. They may be wearing a hoodie because they don't want people to recognize them because they're famous and rich. So, no, I'm not making any judgments about Bill Cosby, but what did Bill Cosby wear all the time? He wore sweatshirts.
Right.
college with the names of colleges on them and sweaters. He'd wear a suit every day. He's one of the richest black men in the world, probably.
Right.
So, but that's just the way he chose chooses to dress.
And I think that's still true today. You know, I mean, you have cases where, you know, I can't remember who it was, but an African American male was going into his house, and you know, some neighbor called. Bill Gates. It happened to him. And it happened to somebody else recently, and I can't remember who that was. And so I think one of the things, and it sounds like this happened as part of the culture, is that those journalists that were involved in the field, they had to really look at their own unconscious bias, even though they might not have done it intentionally, because back then I don't think they really emphasized diversity training and all that kind of stuff.
It took a lot of effort on the part of the news industry organizations to develop training programs, a lot of which I have done in my career. In fact, I came to Savannah a couple of times. I was invited by the executive editor of the Savannah Morning News, someone who is no longer the editor, to come and do some training in her newsroom a couple of times, not just with her staff, and I did this in many cities, but also with people in the community. So that those people in the community can hold them accountable and engage with people in the newsroom and say, well, wait a minute, we understand that you're no longer going to do this. Why do we still see this on page one? Why do we still see more African Americans, you know, committing crimes on page one than when you said you're going to make a change in that? We really had to train a lot of our journalists. There's another reason that we train journalists for this kind of progressive thinking, I guess I would call it, and that is, we know what our experiences are. Everyone knows what their experiences are. And I didn't grow up in a white experience, so I could not say that I understood white people culturally for a very long time after I became a professional. But at some point, I had to learn that I had to live a dual life.
And they call it code switching.
Code switching, but I had to become bicultural. You know, I had to read books by white people, but I also loved reading books written by black people. I had listened to classical music and country music, but I also listened to R&B and soul and you know, all the things that we listened to growing up and during the Motown era. And so a lot of us became bicultural. So we had to also say to our white colleagues, you need to become bicultural. You need to understand that when there's a certain kind of word that a person uses, it really means this and not that. I remember once in our newsroom, we had a black female. She was a leader in the newsroom at USA Today. And they were having a conversation about a relationship between a man and a woman. And she said, oh, his nose is wide open. And all the white people in the room went, what the heck is she talking about? You know, well, what that means is he really likes this person. You know, and that's just a saying that we knew. Those 2 or 3 of us in the meeting that day who were African American, but all the white people were like, "Oh my God, you know, did he hurt her by opening her nose?" So they took it literally. So there are just, you know, but there are things that white people say or said in those days that I didn't understand. You know, and in my first newsroom in Providence, people would talk about the kinds of food they ate for dinner. Oh, you know, I grew up with fried chicken and collard greens, and, you know, things like that. And they were talking about something simple like lasagna. I had never heard of lasagna when I got out of Spelman College. We just didn't have lasagna in my house. I didn't know what it was. Or chicken cacciatore, or you know, these aren't fancy foods. I just didn't know what they were. And Providence specifically was a Polish community, a large Polish and Italian community. And so the conversations were not just black and white, but they were multicultural. Yes, multi-ethnic. And so I had to learn what those things were. And the books they read were very different. So I couldn't have a conversation with people who were sitting in the area that I sat in the newsroom, because I had not read many of those books. I had read the classics, you know, because I majored in English. But I had not read popular books by white people.
And you and I are in common with that, because one of my majors was also in English, and so you read the classical stuff. But one of the things that also I think is that whole multicultural experience is when you know, kids go back to school and their white friends are talking about where they took a trip and what they did, and you know, that's the case for some blacks now, but for a lot of blacks, it is not the case. It's they're still at home. They're lucky if they're going to day camps,
right.
And they're dealing with, just surviving.
Yes, and I did not travel abroad until I was well into my adult
the
years,
version
but I
you
wanted
do
to make sure
of Fell
that my
on
daughter
Black Days,
traveled abroad while she was in high school and beyond. And so for her, it's a culture that she grew up with because I was able to afford that opportunity for her. But you're absolutely right. That in the summer, we generally went home to see grandma.
Right.
And, I lived next door to my grandma, so I didn't have to do that. But my daughter came home to see grandma in the summer, but she went to summer camp every summer in Savannah.
Okay.
And so she had that great experience of living in Northern Virginia most of her life, most of her young life, and coming to Savannah in the summer and interacting with all kinds of people. She probably interacted more with, well, I won't say probably. She interacted, she had the cultural experience in a black church in Northern Virginia.
Right.
And then when she came to Savannah, she went to camp with a lot of people who didn't look like her.
Right. So I'm going to forward this clip along because what he talks about in this is how what's taught in schools to, it pretty much starts the history for blacks with the transatlantic slave trade, which is, I talked about that on a previous show, and it did not address what were you before then. What language did you speak before then? What religious practices, if any, did you participate in? So I'm going to fast forward to that and give you time to think about, how kids are taught in school and what they're learning. Because I think when you grew up in an African American school, especially with teachers that had interest during that time, they made sure you got a bigger picture than the history just started with the transatlantic slave trade. So let me play a little bit of this and we'll get our thoughts together on addressing, that particular issue.
Drug use and disrespecting black women, pushed out. And kids younger and younger are looking up to these rappers and they're looking at like that's what it's supposed to be. Even if they don't aspire to be the rapper, they still look at themselves in that way that the rap music is talking about. Just black people are always doing this. Black people are involved in crime and gangs and shooting, and that's glorified. And that's brainwashing kids to glorify that and think that is what they're there to do. They can't get past that. And that also brainwashes white people to justify every time, a black person is sent away to jail. Every time a black father is taken from his kids, white people don't think twice about it because they see the same things we see, black people just being shiftless, mindless coons. And that has led to the whole stipulation of, you have a white guy who says, I'm not racist, I got black friends that are, there's two kinds of black people. Anytime somebody says that there's two kinds of black people, they're racist, because what they're going to say is you have the classy black people that aren't lazy, they take care of themselves, they aren't loud, and they have a good job. Basically, black people that have conformed to white man's view of how things should be. And then they're going to say, and then you have the ghetto, loud, criminal, typical black person that we see in the media, and then they'll go on and say, well, I don't mind black people as long as they don't act black or what they think black people are supposed to be like. So what's this doing is making young black people not realize their full potential. It's making black people kind of come to a plateau in their social and mental development. And this is keeping black people in the matrix. Now, black people need to unplug from the matrix. You know what the matrix is. The matrix is a common term used because black people are literally plugged into the matrix, just like the movie. We are living in a false reality where we're made to think a certain way about ourselves and what we're capable of doing in life. And also we're made to forget where we really came from and the power that we once had. And also the fact that all human beings migrated from Africa and were black at one time. So racism is stupid because at one time everybody was black. We all share common DNA, mitochondrial DNA from Northeast Africa. Every human being shares it. They teach kids about, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, these peaceful people. But they never teach kids, like, why is Malcolm X not taught in school? Prince Malcolm, peace be upon him, was one of the smartest and most important men to ever walk the earth. And he is so censored and not talked about because people don't want black people to realize that message again. Now I advise
So I'm going to stop the video right there. And again, since we're having technical issues, I'm going to kind of recap for our guest, Wanda. And one of the things he's talking about is how kids are programmed to only start thinking about history in terms of the transatlantic slave trade and not talking about, you know, the successful whether you want to call them Africans, blacks before then. And, you know, for the longest, for me, even in church, when I heard about Egypt, I didn't realize it was on the continent of Africa. You know, I mean, because it was like, oh, coming out of the land of Egypt and the Israelites and blah, blah, blah. The dots were not connected for me as a child. So, and I even see that in some of the Bibles that I see, they don't make that connection. And so not only were you not hearing it in the church, you weren't hearing it in schools. And he talks about, you know, kids being taught about Malcolm, being taught about Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the peaceful things, as opposed to not really learning about Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. And what his language was, and more of the radical, you know, thoughts that he had at the time, or people thought it was radical. And unless kids are exposed to that because of the circle that they're in, they only get one side of the story. So just quickly, because I do want us to get to, you know, what you're working on now and why you're back in Savannah. But any thoughts on that as far as getting kids, you know, how to get kids more connected with the real history?
Well, in terms of media, you know, I would say the first thing that kids need to do, and I think teachers need to make this a priority, is reading.
Right.
And I know that's a challenge for a lot of
reading is fundamental. Yes.
But it's a challenge for a lot of young people. You know, I came back to Savannah, and I know we're going to get to this, to work at Savannah State University.
Right.
As a leader for one of the programs there. And I have to say I was really surprised when I started realizing that a lot of the young people just don't want to read.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's that they can't read, they just don't want to read.
Right.
Now, I understand that this new digital world takes us into a new spot, but you can read online. I read every day online.
Right.
I think my husband thinks that my iPad is connected to my body somehow, because I walk around the house wherever I land, whether I'm sitting in the recliner or sitting on the sofa or sitting at the kitchen table or cooking or whatever I do. I take a break and I sit down and read something.
Right. And I loved reading.
And you know, you don't have to read a book, although I love books. And I'd love to see young people go to the library from time to time and find a book if they can afford to buy them. One of the greatest pleasures I have is going to
the library.
Going to the library, going to the bookstore.
Yes, I still, even though I can get my books on Kindle.
So that's one of the responsibilities that parents and teachers and people in the church and the community have to do. They have to instill in young people the importance of reading.
And there are more books now geared to African American kids.
Absolutely. And make sure that they know what those opportunities are and get them excited about reading.
Right.
And so, you know, we have a lot of organizations in this community, and I'm not just talking about African American kids, but there are a lot of, I know for a fact, sororities, fraternities, churches that are doing projects with young people. And my wish is that we would have more programs about reading. I volunteer for one organization. I volunteer as the Martin Luther King Observance Day Association, and there is a reading program, a reading component in that where there's a book about Martin Luther King, where we go to schools and we take that book and provide all the kids in the class or in the school, I'm not sure, with a copy of the book.
Right.
And so there ought to be more programs like that. So the responsibility really is a community. You know, when I was growing up in Savannah, I grew up on West 41st Street.
Right.
And I consider West 41st Street the 1000 block, I guess that's what we called it. My village.
Right.
It wasn't just the people who lived in my house who were in my village.
Exactly.
It was the entire block of people, and, you know, maybe a block in either direction, northwest, east, northwest.
And people sat out on their porches. They knew when
outside, they talked.
And they knew when you came from school or going to school.
So telling storytelling was another way of enlightening people. People read the newspapers back in the day. I know that people aren't reading newspapers as much, but every newspaper in the world has a website. So for those young people who don't want to pick up a print paper,
They can do it online.
Yeah, they can do it online.
Because I do it online
it's available
too.
To everybody.
Exactly.
So reading is the most important way we have to educate ourselves. It's important to read the Bible, and I hear what you say about the Egypt and the Israelites and all that. But reading the Bible is important, and I read my Bible on my phone. I have to say, even though I have print Bibles in the house, when I go to church on Sunday, I take my phone and there's my Bible. The other is, I want to say that when schools became integrated, there was a change in the way our teachers interacted with the students, but also the passion they had for teaching, at least African American students. I can't speak. I was not one of the ones who integrated. I wanted to go to integrate a school,
and I was one of the ones that.
And my family said, "No, we don't want you to be a martyr. We want you to get an education so you can get into college and have a career and take care of yourself." And in the end, I appreciated that, but I really wanted to be one of those folks who went to. At the time, I guess in my school, Savannah High School. Some of my friends did go to Savannah High School. But what I learned from that experience is that when some of my black colleagues in school did go to Savannah High, they found out that the education system was better at Savannah High School, but the teachers didn't care about them as much in a broad sense. And I won't say all the teachers, but they missed having those good black teachers who pushed them, who understood their potential, who understood where they came from, who
ate the same foods, and may have gone to the same church.
Well, especially going to church and seeing their parents in church and in the grocery store and at the doctor's office. And they had conversations about educating the children that they were teaching with the parents, not just at PTA meetings, but they saw them on the block. They lived in our communities. I grew up in a teaching family, so I know that there were many conversations at night with parents well into the night. So people really cared. The teachers really cared about us in our black schools, and I think we missed that somewhat. Now, we have a lot of caring teachers in all kinds of schools.
I totally get that.
But it just wasn't the same different initially. I don't know what it is now. So here we got these students at Savannah State who, because of their generation, they're not reading. They don't have as much of appreciation of history. And somehow that's got to change. That's got to turn around. So that would be my response to that.
So I know in our conversations you mentioned to me that you're also writing a book. And so, there may be people that want to connect with you as far as on the business side. So share with us as we kind of wrap up today's show, how people can contact you, what your book is going to be about, because I can see you coming back to WRUU, because we do have a show that specifically showcases
that would be great.
People that are writing a book. So this won't be the only time that you're...
So I came back to Savannah in 2013 after I retired from the newspaper business, and I was executive editor of the newspaper in Montgomery, Alabama, and you know when it's time to make that change. And after right around the time I was retiring, I was someone reached out to me from Savannah State University and asked if I would consider coming to interview for the position of chair of the Department of what was then called Mass Communications, now renamed the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications. So that's why I came back to Savannah. As a result of that, I felt like I had come full circle. I had left Savannah. I grew up in Savannah, educated in Savannah, had a marvelous career, did a lot of, I had a lot of outstanding opportunities in journalism, travel, did some teaching, and here I am back. So my book is called Coming Full Circle. That's the tagline for it, because I have come full circle. And then the second line is From Jim Crow to Journalism Giant. The Jim Crow part is I grew up during the era of Jim Crow, and I understand what that means to people, to having grown up in an era when everything was segregated, where there was a restriction on where I could go, when I could go, what I could eat. I wasn't
which door you went to,
exactly, what water fountain I could drink from,
exactly,
who I interacted with on a daily basis.
But
I I became what I would describe as a giant in journalism. I worked with some outstanding people. We're talking today about Bob Woodward and his book about the Trump. Well, I worked in the newsroom at the Washington Post when Woodward and Bernstein first published the book about the Nixon era, and the movie was being done while I was in that newsroom. I've worked with some amazing people, and I have met presidents of the United States, vice presidents. I've interacted with people who are wealthy. I've interacted with people who have great needs in their life, and in the communities where I served as a journalist, and helped to tell some of the great stories in those communities. And so the book is coming full circle from Jim Crow to Journalism Giant. I am in the writing process, but I'm also in the process now of trying to find an agent. If anybody out there is a book agent and wants to help me tell that story, I am ready to find an agent and move forward, have someone shop this story around to a publisher. So that's where I am with the book.
And if folks wanted to connect with you, how would they do that?
Well, I do have a website. It's surprisingly WandaLloyd.com. And you can connect with me through the website, and that connection comes straight to my email. And I'm also on Twitter. My Twitter handle is MGM, which is the airport code name for Montgomery, MGM editor on Twitter. So those are the two ways that I would suggest that people can reach out to me.
Well, thank you so much for being on the One Human Nation show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
And sharing your story. And for our listening audience, remember that the viewpoints expressed in the preceding program were not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. And as we wrap up today's show, I do want to prepare you for coming up next would be Troy Stoner with Sound Limits. And if you want to connect with me to share your story, you can do so at my story at onehumannation.info. And if there's a particular topic about, that's related to what we talk about on the One Human Nation show that you want us to address in more detail, you can send an email to onehumannation, WRUU@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. And as you continue on your race reconciliation journey, remember to be open to other narratives that you typically may not hear, listening to news media that you may not typically tune into, picking up a paper that you typically would not read, just to try to really look at all points of view, because we really, in order to move forward and become one human nation, in my opinion, we have to be able to communicate. And I think that's kind of a lost art, in people being able to talk to each other face to face and being able to communicate and listen to the other side of the story. Again, thanks for listening. Have a great week. And you're going to listen to a little bit of the interlude music that was prepared for me by Joe Gonzalez. And it's called the B Minor Groove for Sandy.